So then Eskom has given South Africans somewhat of a Christmas gift. It says there will be light tomorrow. Load shedding will be suspended at 5 a.m. on Sunday until 5 o'clock Monday morning. That is the 26th of December. Thereafter, stage 2 power cuts will be implemented until 4 p.m. on the 27th. Eskom says reduced power cuts are due to a drop in demand. Well, the power cuts, as I was saying, are expected to continue at the start of next year. In fact, just as soon as the festive period has wrapped up. Vally Padayachee is a former Eskom executive manager with us in studio tonight to have a look at what is happening with the country's energy crisis. Mr. Padayachee, good to have you in studio tonight. So Eskom is saying there'll be no load shedding on Christmas Day, but there's no guarantee that that'll be the gift in the stocking when we wake up tomorrow, because it is still all subject to rapid developments and change.
Good evening, Temekile, and a very good evening to your viewers on this Christmas Eve, and thank you very much for inviting me again. Yes, there's no guarantees that we could get that gift tomorrow morning. It depends on how the grid and the system performs from now till tomorrow morning at 5 a.m. And if it all goes well, then we will get that gift of having no load shedding from 5 a.m. tomorrow to 5 a.m. on the 26th. But yes, the grid is still constrained, and we're actually sitting on a knife edge.
So on Christmas morning, in most households, there's a lot of cooking that goes on. Even people who don't celebrate Christmas are usually hosting during this long weekend, especially on Christmas Day. Is that sort of pressure enough to force a rapid change as far as the power cuts are concerned?
Well, I think Christmas is Christmas Day, and you would not ordinarily expect to have load shedding. I mean, I haven't recalled that we've had load shedding on Christmas Day. So with Eskom pulling out all stops to make this day load shedding free, I think was a good gesture, and I think that must be welcome. But having said that, as I say, there's no guarantee that we'll get there, because the system will dictate that to us.
Let's explain at a very basic level, sir, why it is that so many of Eskom's generators trip so often. What exactly is the problem?
In fact, let me take a step back. You know, to have load shedding around this time of the year is a no-no, because the demand situation is right at its lowest. All the factories, all the offices, almost every activity is down to zero, right? So to load shed in this period, it means that the national grid is severely constrained and at risk of collapsing. And I must clear that we're not there yet, but we are also moving down on that scale quite significantly.
How close are we, do you think, at this point to a complete collapse of the grid, when you consider that, for example, in the last 6 months, stage 6 load shedding has in fact been introduced more frequently than it ever has in the history of these blackouts? Let
me answer it this way, Temekile. We are now sitting at what we call the EAF factor, the energy availability factor, at its lowest for the year. And in fact, many years, we're now sitting at about 51%. It means that 51% of the available capacity of 48,000 megawatts is available on the grid, which means that 49% is not available. And we are left with that 51% to balance the supply and demand. So we are sitting on a knife edge in terms of that, and we are fortunate that, well, if you can call it fortunate, that we have gone down to 51% in a period where the demand is extremely low. I'm very worried that when we get back into January, middle of January, when all the industries, etc., come back, and if we continue with the 51% energy availability factor, then we could get to stages 6, 7, and 8 load shedding. And in that context, I'm saying that the grid is at risk.
And how much of a difference does the fact that more South Africans are getting inverters, they're getting generators, they're finding other forms of energy, shall we say, or other ways to keep their homes electrified, or to at least have a stove running and the rest of it? Does that make a difference at all when it comes to the pressure that Eskom is facing?
Yes, I think it makes a significant difference because it mitigates the demand. It takes the demand away from being imposed on the Eskom grid per se, but generally you cannot get completely off the grid because even with renewables, the sun doesn't shine 24 hours, the wind doesn't blow 24 hours, so you'll have to come back onto the grid for Eskom supply. So that's the significance of that. But the other important factor is that if this continues with more and more customers getting off the grid, then it puts Eskom on a death spiral. And I would argue that Eskom is currently on the path of that death spiral, and it needs to be arrested very quickly.
Right.
Otherwise, there'll be a certain death.
Who can arrest that spiral? How much is in the control of the executives, the board, and government? I
think it needs a collective effort. It needs definitely government as the shareholder. It needs Eskom, the board, and the executive team, and not forgetting the foot soldiers. So it needs to be a consolidated effort, except in the last few years, a number of the competent employees, etc., have left Eskom. And Eskom generation is a very complex machinery, and you need very, very competent staff to run that complex machinery. Unfortunately, we've lost a lot of them.
Just on that point, you've got the acting head of generation who's now resigned. The CEO has resigned. The COO is about to retire, as I understand it. Where does that leave, then, that need for the right leadership to be in place to steer us out of this crisis that's gone on now for more than 14 years?
I'm glad you raised that point, Temekile, because in my last interview here the other day, I made the point that you can have, and I think the new CEO has to do a technical, strategic, and financial turnaround. But he has to also do a psychological turnaround, because I would argue the soul of Eskom is virtually destroyed. And when I say the soul of Eskom, it's the attitude of people, the passionate drive, etc., has all been destroyed given the last few years of load shedding, mismanagement, corruption, state capture, sabotage, etc. So the new CEO, if he needs to turn around this company successfully, he needs to do a complete psychological turnaround. Because, and as I argued the last time, Eskom currently has a number of what I call pathological anomalies in the company. And if that's not attended to, which I think is not being attended to significantly, then Eskom will collapse.
Why do you believe it's not been attended to already?
Well, I'm very close to Eskom. I interact with a lot of them, and I come from Eskom, from generation in the past, and from the comments that I get from reliable sources, and just interacting with people, I can see that soul of the company is no longer there. That light, that enthusiasm from people that generally keep the lights on are not there. They're virtually zombies. But having said that, there is a core group of people that are still giving out their utmost to keep the lights burning. But if that psychological turnaround is not attended to, even that small number is also going to become a zombie, for want of a better word.
If that is the environment internally, you have to wonder, though, why anyone who's at the top of their game in the energy space would even want to take up any of the three available roles, CEO, COO, or even head of generation. I mean, the other complaint, Andre de Ruyter alluded to it somewhat when he finally spoke about his resignation, that once the political tide also turns against you, you almost have to leave immediately.
Yeah, I think Temekile, that sentiment is being expressed now. But I would argue that you will get two types of people that would accept that job. You would get the one person that would demand a fantastic salary package for that, and the other person would be somebody who comes from an SA incorporated, who has a passion to turn around companies, and so I would argue that you would get that second person or type of person that would also put his hand up.
Would you apply? Would you take up the role?
I'll cross that bridge if I'm asked to. I wouldn't apply for it, but if I'm asked to, I'll give it consideration.
But if they ring you, if Mpoma Bwana rings you, then you'll think about it.
I'll think about it, yes.
Vally Padayachee, good to speak to you. Former executive manager at Eskom, speaking to us about the country's energy crisis. At this stage, Eskom is hoping we'll be able to have a load-shedding free Christmas, but it could all change at a moment's notice.